There we go. Great. So just I'm just taking a look at this week's agenda. We have a couple items. Please feel free to add anything that you might like to discuss. As a reminder, I'm filling in for Mark while he's out. I believe he'll be back for the next meeting. Let's see. So the first item is issue. Yes, issue 130. Clarify that SLSA is intended to be automatically verifiable. We did discuss this some at last week's, or pardon me, at the last meeting, and I basically have a proposal down here at the bottom. It definitely seemed to be tripping people up previously. There's a question of like if all of the SLSA requirements can be verified, whereas what at least I had intended when I had expressed my desire for things to be automatically verifiable, that the artifacts that are produced can be automatically verified as having met the SLSA requirements, even if some of the requirements on the systems involved, like the source control systems and the build systems, do require some sort of human analysis. I think that's my thought is that it's probably hard to get automatic verifiability for some of the properties that we want. Like, is a build isolated? Is a build hermetic? These are things that it would be hard, I think, to write some code to check, and likely instead requires that some security team review designs, review code, maybe and maybe perform red teams before finally saying, okay, yes, we certify this build system as meeting SLSA level 3, and then maybe, oh, and by the way, this build system is identified by these keys, and you can use those keys to then verify the provenance that is produced for artifacts, and that you can use to automatically verify the artifacts. That's the thought.
I think that sounds great, Tom. So I agree with your point that some of them are not going to be automatically verifiable. My gut feeling is that they should be reserved for the hardest level to get, which is 4. I don't think 3, it should be unachievable, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing something.
I think one of the things is that a lot of the things which can't be automatically verified are requirements of the platform. So you would achieve that SLSA level by using a platform that's already attained that level. So in the open source case, that would be like, I'm using GitHub Actions to do my builds, and GitHub's attained SLSA 3 for their builders.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things we talked about before, where if there's other aspects of it where you could certify it, or you could use someone who is certified to some degree. I think one of the key pieces is, if nothing else, if our agreement on generally what those individual check marks and requirements are for SLSA 1 through 4, are we able to now go in and identify which ones we know can be automatically verified, and what the process is to automatically verify that. If there's a way effectively to drill down as you go into SLSA, like level 1, 2, and 3, 4, which is, hey, I need to do these 5 things for SLSA 1. They're automatically verifiable, provided I'm using GitHub, using this, using this, using this. So we might have to eventually maybe split it up amongst ourselves to build out the process for each of the criteria.
So I think this is a good clarification, both in narrowing the scope of what is automatically verifiable, but also describing how we indicate trust of like the things that can't be automatically verifiable. Right? We have some kind of keys that indicate provenance produced by this system is trusted up to whatever level. So I think this is a good clarification that we should try and capture in the docs. I don't know what the right way to is the next step just to file a PR and get review on it, or do you think we need to do a show of hands here? Or
it certainly makes sense to me. I think there's probably an interesting consequence if you combine a few of those things together. So first, if the lower level should allow for more automatic verification, that would have the effect of pushing people to use systems that others have vetted, which probably isn't a bad thing because there's a lot of skill required to validate a system. But then, of course, it'll be even more important to have build systems that are compliant and to have a couple of options. And because of the breadth of ecosystems you're trying to target, it could be really tough for some ecosystems to be compliant unless they do all of it. So how do you, I guess the only thing that jumps out at me is how do you also balance compliance needs at lower levels for more esoteric ecosystems, like, I don't know, say in theory Haskell, just because it feels esoteric, but maybe it's easy to implement for.
Yeah, and Zach, you just made me think of another thing, right? Like as an example, like let's just say I'm using GitHub for an open source project. I have my contributors on there. If those contributors aren't using 2FA and other basic security things that are offered by GitHub, you're risking out. Like we have a company where everyone's 2FA, but they have one bot they're using connected to their GitHub that's not protected, which means that could get compromised and go directly into the code. So there's an aspect of like the service may offer the right elements to make sure you meet that criteria, but someone will have to still check like, hey, show me a screenshot that everybody, all your contributors have 2FA enabled as a small example.
Right.
Yeah, I think configurability is an important issue, even, all things being equal for like a compliant platform. Like there's almost inevitably ways to, disable or enable things that break those guarantees. I think it's going to be tough capturing all of the necessary things in, say, the provenance to ensure that is done properly.
Sorry, Matthew. Or in a case where like some things we just talked about, a configuration issue, let's just say you did have an ability to step in and say, okay, an organization will look and say, you are SLSA level, whatever, but like, that's only a snapshot in time. It's kind of like a type 2 stock. Like it's not looking over time. It's say at this point in time, I can say you met this criteria, but someone else is gonna have to double check the next day or later on to be sure, 100% sure.
I also, I agreed, and I do wonder if is manual verification a bad thing? Simply because maybe there should always be an onus on someone or someone's to understand that they've implemented the process properly. Because you're right, there are too many ways, Donnie and others, you're right, there are too many ways around. You can always misuse a system. There should be someone has to take accountability that it's actually right. Even in
Sure.
the
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I believe Tom raised his hand also, so he should go first. I'll raise my hand.
Yeah. So I definitely agree. Some methods that could be used to address these sort of configurability problems, like does everything require 2FA, for example. One of the routes that we're pursuing internally is that the source control system has a switch that you flip, which after it's flipped, you can't go back. And so ideally, what would happen is like GitHub would have a switch that's like everyone has to use 2FA and you can't fall back. And then the verification is either ideally GitHub could like issue some sort of attestation for that repo that says this is enabled. Now, if that doesn't happen, then I think that another route is one that Matt had suggested, which is like you could leverage something like scorecards, which is where you don't have the source control system sort of issuing an attestation that says, hey, it's configured in this way, but rather you could have like scorecards monitoring that repo, and it can issue attestations that say, hey, like I checked at this time and it required and like everyone needed 2FA, and I checked the day before that and it required 2FA, and the day before that, and so forth.
I honestly think the builder case is trickier than source. Source, it's a much more structured like domain. I feel like there's fewer knobs. With builder, a lot of the, not esoteric, but there are a lot of sort of higher level security statements that the levels make, at least now, that are.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, like when I'm looking at this from a internal build perspective from IBM, everyone knows, so I speak to on other calls, we want to use Tecton chains and SigStore and attestation logs, and the whole goal is what you're describing, I think, Matthew, in terms of capturing the environment. What's the platform we're running on, what's the input. So we want to, we know that we can't achieve reproducibility, but at least sign and store the artifacts that at least manually give the information you could to try to reproduce on your own, which is not a bad thing, in alignment with what Zach was saying. It's not bad, and that's exactly what I view like Apache Foundation. I cite them often. Is their release process is very stringent, and it's a pain. But once you get it established, you're grateful because it requires manual review. It requires manual reproducibility and verification of signatures before anything's ever released. So give them the information, give them as much as you can, capture it, verify those things, tell them they exist, and verify those things exist. Scorecard. This whole world is about continuous compliance and diffs on a regular basis, on a continuous basis. So yeah.
Michael?
Yep. So one thing I think, I know this was brought up in one of the related GitHub issues. One of the concerns I know that I have internally is, what is the currently, right? Like there's no proof that even if you were to provide these attestations coming from GitHub's could be lying to you about some of those things. And so I think that there's definitely some sort of baseline that should also be discussed in that regarding, hey, look, for some of these key tools that you are sort of saying, SLSA, your builder is providing this attestation, you have to have some sort of baseline level of security, because, right, if somebody were to, let's say it is GitHub that's providing some sort of signed thing, or actually probably that's a bad example because they're huge, but like if, let's say, some builder is providing a signed thing, well, you need to make sure that whoever has those keys is not signing that, yeah, the builder's fine, right? Because I know that's one of the big worries for us.
Yeah, so and the one thing I'm looking at is like what you're saying, all these things speak to me is as the 2 eyes rule or the 4 eyes rule. So how do we enforce that? So I've been looking closely to figure out how programmatically things like prow and things could be added to verify those things, to go through the GitHub organizations and authorizations and things, at least to show that you have a authorization, authentication point of view established, and some type of automated process to enforce that through the review system and the approval system and the release process.
So to that point, Mike, like I definitely think no one's getting around the consumer, the automatic or like annual consumer of this provenance, having some sort of like assessment or like evaluation of all of the builders they're gonna end up trusting. I think it's difficult, but like you need to say, for instance, for a given builder, what keys you're gonna trust. So that just gets up down to like core PKI, like identity stuff, but also honestly those high level security guarantees like hermeticity, reproducibility, all the things. And
Yes.
whether you leave this system to be meeting them. And I think talking about it on the producer side is great, but like ultimately, if they're like, it's the consumer that kind of needs to make the call.
Exactly. I wanted to add to that also, which is that I think we can actually simplify this. Whether it's manual or automatic, attestation of these things, this properties about your systems, how are you going to verify them as a consumer? Exactly. You're going to do them automatically. So what does manual attestation really mean other than knowing somehow that it's the human being who signed this attestation as opposed to some machine? Maybe that's the best you can do cryptographically, right?
Yeah, and I think that some of that probably rests on how we agree to like certify things at like higher SLSA levels, because certainly at like level 1 and 2, I don't know that we have any requirements on how the key material is handled. But I think certainly at level 4, it would be very fair for us to say that like no human should be able to like sign anything with these keys. That can only be like the role that's running the build system. And that would then of course like leverage back onto like, well, who reviewed the design that said that it's actually doing it that way. Yeah.
I like the idea of like having a very like public like security statement be published like by builders, or like something like that, like linking off to I don't know, like an assessment, like a professional assessment, or just walking through maybe the pieces or the I don't know, yeah, why or how you meet criteria X, Y, and Z.
I think that there's an outstanding issue related to this that perhaps Trishanka and Joshua were going to look into, which is how to communicate the trust around keys. I'm having a hard time pulling it up right now. We'll see if I can find it.
We have a detailed audioscape of someone chewing at the moment. So maybe someone needs to mute. Fantastic.
Okay, so I think that this was some very good discussion. If I could summarize where I think that we've landed, it's that it sounds like the split as proposed in issue 130 regarding automatic verifiability makes sense, and that we've outlined that there's sort of additional open questions around how you imbue trust into certain keys, or how that gets communicated, and so forth, and that is future work that needs to be done. Is that fair?
I have a quick question on this. Do we have any clarity on the lower levels? Like, it would be nice to have a little more clarity with respect to lower levels if possible. Trishank? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you mean for the trust? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think Joshua, you should chime in also. We want to say that this is one way for you to imbue trust on your keys, right? You may already have your own existing infrastructure, as I think Abhishek is alluding to imbue trust already. For example, some people may want to reuse the existing X509 infrastructure, right? Which is totally fine. This is one proposal for using something called TUF, which I believe the CNCF recommends this to secure deployments. So this is after your whole build system, your developers have produced attestations and everything. How do you package all of that up and then say, why should you trust these keys? Joshua, do you have anything to add to that? Does this make sense?
I think that makes sense. Yeah. I don't have anything to add at this point. We've talked about effectively prototyping something like this with Puff in issue 101. So I think this discussion is a good indication of like a need to get to that prototyping work effectively.
So it might be, it really depends on the platform. To go back to Abhishek's question, like how easy would, for example, using Tough would be for like the lower levels. I think level 1 probably wouldn't even use it, right? There's probably really no attestations there, really. I could be wrong. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, for things like level 2 and 3 and so forth, we expect automation to handle a lot of this for you. Maybe the platform gives it to you, or if you're willing to do it, you're willing to do some of the manual work yourself, like offline keys and so on. It's definitely good questions to discuss on the in our proposal, whatever Joshua and I end up writing. I see. Thanks, Joshua and Tom. Got it. Oh, Michael has a.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna second that. And then from my understanding, just as sort of mostly as the end user of a lot of the SLSA stuff, the thing that I'm viewing sort of level 1 as is like level 1 is getting started establishing just provenance. Even if that provenance is incorrect, it's better than literally not knowing anything that's going on. So even if the stuff that you're doing is signed by invalid stuff and is or sorry, not signed, but if it's being generated by compromised things, it's still better to have it and to then eventually work backwards and fix stuff than it is to not have it at all and not even know where to start.
So I think that might be a good segue into the next agenda item. I think it was at the last meeting that we mentioned that Matthew had put together this doc sort of outlining the goals for, or pardon me, proposed goals for each of the SLSA levels. And I think if enough people think that this sounds good, then maybe Matt can put a PR together to sort of codify these things. And if you don't think they're good, like, please send feedback.
Honestly, also just figuring out realistic or more creative use cases for specific things, for a specific or a blocker that you might have moving to the next level. That's a big sort of, it's an intent of the kind of use cases as well.
I can definitely provide, as an end user, not somebody who's not like developing software that's intended to be sold, but like building our own internal stuff, and obviously like banking apps, that kind of thing. I think for us, like one of the big things that we want to also make sure of is like, I think that also ties back into the sort of what is the general scope of SLSA, making sure that like when looking at this and looking, what does, like the sorts of things I'm looking at, not just purely from a regulatory and compliance perspective, but just other, generally like, oh, SLSA helps us deal with these things. Like if we start to follow the the SLSA framework, that helps, mitigate these sorts of risks, and it's focused around these sorts of things. Whereas, let's say, NIST 853, to be clear, I'm not saying that they're equivalent in any way. I'm just kind of saying like, whereas that sort of handles these sorts of things. There's some overlap between them. There's like those sorts of things I think helps us out because, when I also look at some of the use cases, there's a lot of, I have a lot of use cases around supply chain security. I'm not sure if all of them fit necessarily under SLSA.
yes, I agree with you that it's important to have the scope defined. I think so far it's so far the scope is strictly tampering, and I wonder if you feel like that, or if anyone feels that that is either insufficiently broad, or if it needs further discussion around what exactly we mean by tampering.
So my quick 2 cents is I'm curious what, so I understand it from the tampering perspective, and I think if I would also be I think that maybe if that's like the breadth, it'd be useful to understand a little bit of the depth, because as an example, right, like I could today, right, assuming I have a builder, I'm using Tecton, I'm using Chains, I'm using Intoto, I can still have that if I have a builder, and assuming that the builders themselves are not coming in and being authorized, I could have a builder still do whatever it needs to do, create compromised artifacts, and all the things are going to sign it, right? Everything's going to say, yep, it was signed. I can say that it wasn't like within the scope of what was happening there, it wasn't tampered with, but my stuff is still compromised at that point. So I'm curious to know, like, okay, well, what are, like, yeah, how deep do you go there?
Trishik?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Michael. And I think we could disagree here, but I don't think the aim of SLSA is to say that we never ever deliver compromised artifacts. I don't think anyone could guarantee that, right? We do our best efforts. Is I think we should make that clear. That's important.
Oh, I to be clear, I agree as well. I think the question then just becomes like, if there are certain things that are, let's say, out of scope of SLSA, then it's clearly like, okay, SLSA is focused around these things. We're saying, hey, look, at the end of the day, let's say you are checking for signed builders, and somewhere down the line has compromised the Linux kernel supply chain. There's nothing SLSA is going to be able to do for you there. But it would be useful to kind of know where those things, where SLSA begins and ends, so that we can kind of say, hey, look, as the end user, if you are concerned about those things, that's very much stuff you have to sort of deal with. But to better understand, some of those things, right? Like if SLSA recommends, all of your build tools should be signed, and maybe something like have a transitive SLSA score or something like that, where, yes, you're, let's say, installing Cargo, Rust, all that sort of stuff. You should be using signed versions of those things. You should be checking the hashes of those things, yada, yada. Then, oh, I see that kind of mitigates these sorts of attacks, right? Whereas if somebody came in with an unsigned version of Cargo and, builds an artifact, oh, okay, now I understand why that was compromised.
Yeah, I have some thoughts there, but let's hear from Shock.
Yeah, it strikes me that some of the value is, even if a compromised, let me get rid of that. Even if you have a compromised artifact that reaches production, which is the nightmare scenario, it's still useful to have a forensic chain that can give you a fighting chance of working out how it got there. Each of the levels of assurance makes it both harder to tamper and easier to detect where tampering occurred, even if that's by not deduction, abduction, or abducing, whatever. The fancy thing that Sherlock does, where he eliminates possibilities, and then whatever's left has to be the thing. And it's the same thing. As you add each of these controls, more and more possibilities that a tampering could have occurred in such and such a way are eliminated, and the places you have to look are reduced. Does that fit what you were saying, or have I gone off topic?
So yeah, I 100% agree with you on that front. I definitely see the forensic chain as being super important. I think one thing, and I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole, right? Where there is the concern around like, well, you have a forensic chain, but if your supply chain was compromised, is that now compromising all the rest of your tools throughout your entire system? And then, your ability to actually do the forensics is now compromised. I don't want to, like, to be clear, I'm not saying that we want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think at least sort of saying, yeah, that's still a risk. And that's something that you need to kind of sort of, whether it's separate trust domains or whatever, like at least sort of put that out there as a risk.
Yeah, so thank you for this. And yes, it does seem as though it's sort of the transitive dependency problem, like whether or not that dependency is like code that's included in the final artifact, or like code that was used to produce it. Sort of my expectation is that those things are in scope for SLSA the project, but that it might not be addressed at SLSA level 1 through 4. Like at least as it's currently defined, for SLSA 1 through 4, we sort of ruled out transitive, the problem of like transitivity, because it's sort of a recursive problem, and you need your base case first, and this is the base case, and like the way that I'm thinking about using it is by being able to like look at the artifact that I got and seeing what its SLSA level is, and then using the provenance to see what its dependencies are and what SLSA level they have, and then being able to like recurse through sort of through that to sort of figure out where we need to make further investments.
Yeah, I think Joshua said just as a way of making trust relationships explicit. I think that's a great sort of headline for especially like a lower level sort of just get all of the provenance you want. Just figure out where you're, I don't know, where you're vulnerable or what you were vulnerable to. And if nothing else, it provides a way to sort of prioritize, collective risk maybe across the industry.
Yeah, it's a hygiene play. And in the same way that, a great sewage system in one city doesn't help them if their water is contaminated upstream, it still matters. And it's about the health of an entire ecosystem here, not just a particular actor.
Right. So maybe to add to that, would it be fair to say, let me try to paraphrase Tom's to see if I understand him correctly. Maybe SLSA should be focused on any one actor's particular play, that particular project, right? The one actor could have many projects, and you can't really guarantee anything about the rest of the system. You could recursively, as a consumer, go and check their SLSA supply chain to be one attestations, but I don't think that one particular actor is responsible for it. Did I capture correctly, Tom, or?
I think that that's accurate as to where we are now. But I think that I would like to see, in a couple of years, once things are sorted out, that maybe there's room for like a SLSA level 5 or level 6 that says you must use SLSA level 4 or higher, or higher artifacts, because at some point, like as a project maintainer, I do and I don't have control over the supply chain of my dependencies. Like I can't necessarily go and fix it for them, but I do have a choice about which dependencies I take. And like if I see that they're bad and that there's high risk, then I can ask them to fix it, which might include funding, or I can pick a different way to fulfill that requirement of my product.
And it should also then be much easier to identify critical security bottlenecks. And it's funny,
Yes,
this is
and
shifting security so far left, it moves out of your org in some cases.
right, and hopefully something that can happen is that the community can see, oh, look, there are 1,000 of us depending on this one project that has poor hygiene. Maybe we can all like pitch in to fix that.
So does this imply that it's really beneficial to have a registry for basically every dependency with a SLSA status of like, oh, unknown, so you can have a place to look and try and trace back through a tree? Because it doesn't matter if you comply or not to start with, it simply matters if you can be identified. And that would have a nice network effect then.
Donnie?
Yeah, I agree with that, Zach. Another thing that to consider, and this is probably going deeper at a certain point as it matures, but there's a point, especially with open sources, do you want to assign a reputation score or even look at the individual contributors to that dependency? Like maybe that dependency is a SLSA level, but are we vetting or verifying? Do we know who's actually contributing to that? And we know that we trust them or have some degree of reputation or some degree of time in contributing to the software.
Interesting.
Okay, so I think that was a pretty good discussion. My takeaway is that generally, and we can wait. We can wait to see. Generally, no one has any issues with the ladder goals as Matt spelled out, but that we feel that there's still a bit more work to be done in defining not the level and ladder goals, but sort of the broader goals for SLSA in particular. That is like that just saying that that the goal is to prevent tampering is not quite sufficient, and that we can outline some of these other future use cases. Is that a fair place that we've wound up? Okay.
I think so, yeah. So if I understand you correctly, for now at least, for our initial roadmap, levels 1 to 4, we'll focus on what we can realistically achieve today. For the next few years, while we build up the ladder for levels 5 and above.
I think that makes sense to me. Great. All right, so moving on, tagging version 0.1. Abhishek has proposed that we have a goal of tagging it by September 15th. Does anyone have any last minute reviews that they would like to do? Any issues that they would like to see resolved before this point release? You don't necessarily need to get them in now, but maybe in the next day or two.
Do we need any more clarity on the automatically verifiable point before we tag point 1? Like, Joshua, do you want to take a stab at the text before we do that?
I seem to recall there were a couple of issues we discussed in either previous meeting or the one before that we had talked about trying to resolve before an initial release. I think one of them was the requirement for the best definition of source, was it? Which I think Tom's taken a stab at, but I'm trying to scroll back through the notes and find.
There were two that I'm aware of. One One is issue 115, which has been resolved, which is that as written, the requirements previously required config as code at levels 1 and 2. And that's just not how a large number of build systems work today. So that was resolved. Another one, I don't know if it's so much, well, pardon me. I suppose it is related to issue 129, which is better defined source, but there is issue 127, I think, which is making version control required at level 1. This one is not resolved. I think that we could punt on this until the next revision, or we could try to resolve it now. I think that with the latter goals that Matt outlined, and the discussion around automatic verifiability, that I might propose that we close this as won't fix, but I'd like to hear what other people think. Yeah, Michael.
So I think it's worthwhile to just ask the question of I personally think that, every SLSA level should provide something. There should be, some, oh, it does this for you. So it'd be useful to understand, it would be useful for me to understand, without source code control, does it actually provide, does it provide any value? But I also recognize, I know one of the things that was brought up in some of the sort of off-channel discussions was there is a lot of software that is out there that is like a gzipped tarball that's on some professor's website, and a lot of people are downloading it, unpacking it, and compiling it, especially in the machine learning world. And is there still value in handling that versus saying everybody has to use source code control?
Yeah. So I think that there are two thoughts there. So one is in the SLSA ladder motivation doc. It does discuss what level 1 does, even in the absence of source code control. Now, whether or not you find that compelling, that's a different story. Please provide comments if you don't. I think that to the one of the issues that I have with requiring source control at level 1 is it goes along with the automatic verifiability aspect, because what we very well may have is that you might have a CI/CD system that works in multiple steps, and in step 1 it checks out the source code from some repo, zips it up, and then drops it in a bucket, and then in the very next step it takes the zip file out of that bucket and does the build. And if that build step is the thing that's producing the provenance, which is good, that still helps us out, we don't have a record in the provenance of the source control system that it came from. So it would look as though it's failing that requirement, but the organization that has that set up, they might say, but we are using source control. So.
Yeah. So my only other 2 cents, and this is just coming from because I'm very much on the fence with it, just because there's an element of kicking people to just really start doing the right thing. If you are not putting your code in, in actual sort of a real version control system, whatever it may be, you got problems. And with that said, I also recognize on the other end, there is a pretty reasonable way of just saying, yeah, but at least with Salsa 1, without the source code thing, you're starting to know where is this code coming from, right? And I think like, but I think we need to just be clear, like, if you're only doing Salsa 1, you're really not getting much, if any, value out of it. And in fact, it's kind of scary. But like, I think on that end, I think there's, Salsa 1 at least is coming off to me like you have a legacy environment, right? You are somebody who, you have shadow IT, you have a legacy environment that, with people doing silly things to, work around stuff. Whereas you should be trying to get to Salsa level 2 as quickly as possible. But I guess maybe even I convinced myself that Salsa 1 seems to be reasonable for that of, just saying, look, if you're not using source code control, we're going to at least, in the very least, tell you where the code came from, but we're not making any attestation, assertion about anything that's going on inside the code itself, right? Because you could be pulling a zip file that's good one day, the next day you pull down what you think is the same zip file, and it turns out it's something completely different, and there'd be no way to validate.
Another potential justification for it being should would just be like towards like automatic verification. If you can't automatically verify like from your build system does not know if your source is in source control. This is just a, hey, that's a work item for you to get to L2. You need to know you're fetching it from somewhere that has all of the properties that will be built on later. Yeah.
Yeah, so great. So picking up some of the comments in the chat thread, there's a suggestion that like maybe Salsa 1 should actually be called Salsa level 0. Trishank would, or like Axel and Trishank, would you like to speak to those things?
Oh, sorry. You mean clarify between L0 and L1? Yeah, I think there should be a difference. L0 should be the case of absolute nothing. Maybe to use Michael's running example of downloading a random tarball from a professor's website, right? Over HTTP, no less. L1 should give you something more, in my estimation. Otherwise, why call it L1 at all? I think we should distinguish between no security and some, a little bit, not much, to change the world, but it gives you something extra. And in this case, I believe it's unsigned attestations at the very least.
Yeah, so just to kind of also just go back one step. Yeah, I think if you are downloading it from a random professor's website, I think the one thing is, or just a random, you're pulling it from somewhere, a shared drive or whatever. I think the one thing that Salsa 1 still does provide right now is that you are making that explicit. You are saying, or at least it should be explicit in the Salsa level, right? You are explicitly saying, I am pulling this from a website. I am, wgetting, or I'm curling it. I am pulling it from the shared drive, that sort of thing. Because then in the very least, you know, hey, where this came from. Or like even something like, I am looking for this to show up under /temp somewhere at some point. Like at least making that explicit, then the sorts of things of, okay, that needs to get fixed. Because I know like in the enterprise, I know one of the biggest concerns for us is just that shadow IT problem, right? Where some developers somehow figured out some way of doing these things. And even in the very least, if we can start to sort of say, look, we want to have we want to have some metadata. Let's just say we want to have some in toto layout, right? You are specifically saying you're doing these bad things. You have 2 weeks to fix it, right? Or we just start to say you can't, you can't, we're not letting you push your code to production, first off, and we're not even going to let you push your code to QA until you get that sorted out. Sorry.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Jacques.
Yeah, so in terms of what should or shouldn't be in L1, it seems to me like this goes back to the question of how much of SLSA is intended for prevention, controls that make it impossible to do this or do that, so permissions around build systems, that kind of thing. How much of it is straight up detection? I've detected some kind of tampering has occurred, and so I can take action. And the last one is that third sort of slightly strange case of forensics, where I neither prevented nor detected the tampering at the time, but I want to be able to reduce the places where I go and do a forensic inspection to work out how a tampering occurred when it was detected out of band somehow. The reason I bring those up is because to me, it seems like the downloading the source code from the professor's website kind of has none of those things. Right. So I would argue that at L1, at least one of those three kind of general categories has to be satisfied. It's either preventing, detecting, or making forensics tractable, which you lack all three, in my opinion.
I mean, in the motivations thing, I think the big I don't know, overarching theme that it fell out of the levels is more just about increasing like data and integrity assurance. It's not necessarily about how you apply or use that data, be it for forensics, for admission control, for whatever. It is about sort of understanding the unknowns in your system and then being able to act on them. It's not so much, it feels like gradually I don't know, increasing security. I mean, it is, but really what that means is decreasing the scope of the things that you don't know so that you are able to make decisions about what you want.
Yeah, so yes, and so I think to that point that at lower SLSA levels, like they can do something in the way of prevention, but there are still plenty of ways for an attacker to get around it. But it does certainly provide for that forensic ability, because the fact that you pulled the source code from a website should be encoded in the provenance. Like there will be a URI that was fetched from and a hash of the archive, and that can be used by an analyst to try to figure out where the bad thing came from.
Can I pivot slightly then to propose another sort of axis for categorizing what goes where, which would be, it sounds to me like we have, well, really two axes, two kinds of things that are helping to categorize what goes into each level. One of which is what is the capability of the attacker that we're worried about. So how motivated, how capable. And the other one is how much effort it is for the defender. Like how complex is this to achieve? So for example, something like source control is pretty simple. I go and create an account on GitHub and it's all there. Something like capturing the provenance of a download probably takes more effort and might have a different capability. I don't have an answer of like how I would lay that out. I just know that I have a consulting background, so I smell a 2x2 and I have to have it.
Yeah, I think that's basically just like, what's the value proposition of this? And talking about that with all of the things, I think is just total common sense. Like that should be like, hey, how much cost is this for the average person? How much value do we get? Talking about the sophistication of attackers, maybe it's valuable, but fundamentally, like just your average, I don't know, convenience hacker versus a government. So security.
So I'm cognizant of time, and we have 2 minutes left. I'm not sure where we've landed with tagging a point release. I wonder if like people. So I will propose an issue in the GitHub repo and tag the committee members, and we can have a discussion there. Okay. All right. Well, that is basically all the time we have. Thank you all very much for your participation, and we'll see you next time.
See you, folks.
Thank you. Great discussion. Bye.